This case takes place in the USA in the year 2025. On the 14th of June, just before 2 a.m., two Minnesota families slept soundly in their homes, unaware of the danger approaching. It began with a knock at the door. A man's voice outside claimed to be the police, insisting that the family inside open up. But on the porch stood a figure in body armor and a face mask. This is the case of the Minnesota murders. Melissa Ann Hortman was a 55-year-old state representative who dedicated her life to public service. She was born in 1970, excelled in school, and graduated from Blaine High School in 1988. She went on to earn a bachelor's degree in philosophy and political science, and then a law degree, and then a master's in public administration at Harvard. Friends described Melissa as warm and down-to-earth, someone who would drop everything to help a neighbor in need. Before running for office, Melissa practiced law and served on local commissions, channeling her drive to improve her community. She was first elected to the State House in 2004, and as Speaker, she helped enact landmark laws expanding school meals, family leave, and clean energy, leaving a lasting impact on the state. Her colleagues described her as an incredible leader who led with integrity, grace, and determination to improve people's lives. Melissa also had a husband named Mark. The couple raised their two children, Sophie and Colin. Mark had built a career for himself in the tech industry, and he was admired for his intelligence, kindness, and generosity. In every aspect of life, the Hortmans put family and community first, which makes what happened to them so tragic. But Melissa wasn't the only politician who was victimized. John Anthony Hoffman was a 60-year-old Minnesota state senator representing District 34. He was born and raised in Minnesota, too. He worked for years as an advocate in education, primarily focusing on programs for children with disabilities. John and his wife Yvette were deeply rooted in the Champlin community, where they raised their daughter Hope. Friends described them as a couple who lived for their daughter. But these lives would be forever changed in the early hours of the 14th of June 2025 when their homes became the target for an armed impersonator. In early June 2025, an unknown assailant prepared a mission of terror. He had spent months compiling a handwritten list of dozens of public officials and their home addresses. Notes beside the names detailed personal facts and neighborhood layouts. This attacker gathered guns, wore a ballistic vest with a fake police tag, and fitted flashing lights to a black SUV. Disguised as a law enforcement officer with a silicone mask, he set out just before dawn on June the 14th. Friends and family noticed nothing amiss beforehand. This man concealed his scheme from everyone around him. No one had a single clue, but his targets were elected Democrats, and he intended to surprise them at their homes. The stage was set for a violent ambush under the cover of darkness. Melissa Hortman and John Hoffman were at their homes with their families, unaware that they were on this unhinged man's list. Shortly before 2 a.m., this man parked outside Hoffman's two-story house and activated the vehicle's police-style lights. Wearing a tactical vest and armed with a 9mm handgun, he walked up to the front door and began pounding loudly. The unsuspecting couple inside awoke to the sound of urgent knocking and a man's authoritative shouts. This masked intruder yelled, "This is the police." "Open the door." John Hoffman came to the door with Yvette. The masked man outside shone a flashlight into their eyes and claimed that there had been reports of a shooting inside their home. He demanded to know if they had any weapons, but as soon as they noticed that this man's face was covered, Yvette then shouted that this man was not a cop. But with this, the man tried to force his way inside their home. John lunged forward to push the intruder back out the front door. However, almost immediately, the disguised man opened fire. He shot John repeatedly at close range, 9 times, hitting his abdomen and elbow. Then, He sprayed bullets through the doorway, hitting Yvette 8 times in the abdomen as she attempted to slam the door shut. The Hoffmans' adult daughter, Hope, was upstairs and watched in horror as her parents were gunned down. Hope then frantically called 911 as the assailant fled into the night. Emergency services soon arrived on the scene to find John and Yvette bleeding out. Both were rushed to a hospital in critical condition as the police broadcast an alert for an active shooter. Unaware that his victims were still alive, the gunman pressed on. Just minutes later, at around 2:24 a.m., he drove to his second target, the home of State Representative Kristen Bonner in Maple Grove. Again, this man banged on the door and shouted that he was law enforcement serving a warrant. Thankfully, this time no one was home as the legislator was on vacation with her family. After getting no answer, this man just moved on. However, he had someone else in mind. At 2:36 a.m., police in New Hope, already alerted to the Hoffman shooting, sent a lone officer to check on another official's house. When the officer arrived, she spotted a black SUV idling down the street and a man inside wearing what appeared to be a uniform. Assuming he was a fellow police officer, she pulled alongside and tried to speak to him. But this man just stared straight ahead in eerie silence. Unnerved, but seeing no immediate danger, the officer continued to the official's house. By the time that backup arrived, this suspicious SUV had vanished. The man inside this SUV was the attacker, and fortunately this deterred him from attacking the house of Senator and rest. However, he still wasn't done. The attacker drove next to Brooklyn Park, targeting the home of Speaker Melissa Hortman. At around 3:35 a.m., two local police officers arrived at Melissa's address to conduct a precautionary safety check, of course, due to the recent attack. The police immediately noticed a black SUV in the driveway. Then they noticed a man in police-like uniform standing several feet from the door holding a flashlight and a gun. As soon as the officers stepped out of their squad car, the man in the police-like uniform began firing his weapon. The officers dug for cover and returned fire. But amid the chaos, the gunman managed to get through Hortman's front door. Mark and Melissa had heard the commotion downstairs. And so, with Mark leading, the couple began walking downstairs. But as they did, the attacker opened fire. Mark was shot multiple times. Melissa tried to run back upstairs, but the attacker raised his handgun and fired repeatedly, hitting Melissa on the staircase. Both husband and wife collapsed, mortally wounded in their own home. Outside, one officer radioed urgently, telling the control room that the shooter was still in the house and believing that the suspect might be barricading himself inside. But in reality, this attacker had slipped through the back door into the night, escaping just as reinforcements swarmed the area. Police then cautiously entered the residence and found Mark unresponsive by the entrance. They dragged him outside and attempted life-saving measures, but tragically he was pronounced dead shortly after. Then, using a camera-equipped drone, officers searched the house and soon located Melissa upstairs. She was beyond help with multiple gunshot wounds. And tragically, the Hortmans' beloved golden retriever, Gilbert, had also been shot. In a span of barely 90 minutes, 2 people were dead along with a beloved pet, and 2 more were grievously wounded, and worse yet, the perpetrator had vanished. What followed was the largest manhunt in Minnesota's history. News of the shootings quickly spread. Every law enforcement agency in the region was informed. Investigators from the FBI, ATF, state police, and local departments mobilized immediately, fanning out to secure multiple crime scenes. Governor Tim Walz announced the attack as an act of targeted political violence and urged the public to remain vigilant. Crucial evidence soon turned up at the Hortman murder scene in Brooklyn Park. The suspect's abandoned Ford Explorer was still parked in the driveway, riddled with bullet holes from the police shootout. Inside the vehicle, investigators discovered 5 guns. They also found several notebooks filled with handwritten notes. One notebook listed more than 45 names of elected officials, almost all Democrats, each with home addresses and personal details. And this list wasn't even limited to Minnesota. It included officials from at least 5 neighboring states, all of them affiliated with pro-choice or progressive causes. Investigators realized right away that they were now dealing with a coordinated assassination plot that could have been even more devastating if not for the quick police intervention at the final target's home. As forensic teams combed through the evidence, a massive manhunt was already unfolding. But by Saturday afternoon, the killer was identified: Vance Luther Bolter, a 57-year-old man from Green Isle, Minnesota. Vance's name and photograph were released to the public. The image showed him as a heavy-set man in a light cowboy hat and came with a warning that he was armed and incredibly dangerous. The police quickly tracked Vance's cell phone to a house in North Minneapolis where he rented a room. At this home, a security camera had captured him briefly returning at around 6 a.m., just hours after the shooting. By the time that SWAT teams arrived, Vance was already gone. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description boarding a bus with duffel bags. Investigators then tracked him further, but they found that he had paid cash for a new car and vanished again. As the police were closing in on Vance, the break in the case came on Sunday, the 15th of June. In the early evening, a motion-triggered trail camera on a rural property in Green Isle snapped a photograph of a muddy, exhausted-looking man crawling through a field. Investigators converged on the area and soon spotted the suspect lying prone in tall grass. At 9 p.m., after 43 hours on the run, Vance was captured just 1 mile away from his home. He surrendered to law enforcement without a fight, ending the frenzied 2-day manhunt. Following Vance's arrest, investigators uncovered even more evidence of his motives and methods. Discarded in the vicinity of the Hortman home were the suspect's silicone face mask, a bulletproof vest, and the fake police badge that he had used. And in the car that he had paid cash for, agents found a crumpled, rambling 6-page letter addressed to the FBI director. Vance Bolter claimed that he was part of a wild conspiracy involving Minnesota's governor and political leaders in the state. He claimed that Minnesota's governor, senior lawmakers, and other Democratic officials were part of a shadowy criminal network controlling politics, business, and law enforcement. The writings tied in grievances about abortion laws, government tyranny, and corruption at the highest levels of state power. Vance presented himself as a patriot who had gone to war against the supposed cabal, insisting that he was fighting to save the country. Vance even claimed that he had been approached by Tim Walz himself and had been asked to assassinate these people. Tim Walz's office issued a flat denial, stressing that the governor had no relationship with the killer. Federal agents dismissed the manifesto as delusional and stressed that none of his allegations had any foundation in reality. They also discovered that Vance had left a text message for his family on the morning of the attack, telling his wife that he was going to war and warning her that armed police might be coming to the house any time soon. Vance urged her to take the children and flee, which she did. But in fact, the police had already intercepted Vance's wife, Jenny, and their kids at a traffic stop 100 miles away. Found with her were 2 handguns, $10,000 in cash, and a passport. Jenny told officers that her husband was a survivalist prepper and that she had been completely unaware of his dark plans to kill. Investigators soon searched Bolter's family home and seized nearly 50 firearms along with a tub of ammunition stockpiled in the basement. But who was this man? Vance was a 57-year-old with no prior criminal record of violence. He had worked in the food industry for decades. But in 2020, things took a slightly darker turn. He switched to a series of death-related jobs such as removing human remains for funeral homes and even recovering organs for a medical facility. In early 2025, Vance traveled to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He pursued a very short-lived business venture and returned home disheartened and depressed. Friends later told reporters that they were stunned by the allegations against him. None of them had seen any warning signs. Outwardly, Vance presented as a devout Christian and a family man. He and his wife Jenny had been married for years and were raising several children in a house around 50 miles away from Minneapolis. The couple had bonded over a shared belief of self-reliance and survival preparedness. They were preppers who stockpiled supplies and weapons for worst-case scenarios. Among friends, Vance rarely discussed politics, which makes this even stranger. One friend noted that Vance disliked prominent Democrats like Joe Biden, but he never mentioned any of the lawmakers who were shot, and he rarely ever talked about politics, sometimes actively avoiding it. It seems that he tended to keep any extremist views to himself. However, in private, he began to believe that government leaders were corrupt oppressors. Unbeknownst to those around him, Vance spent hours using internet databases and social media to track politicians' personal lives. By mid-2025, Vance's family life was deteriorating under the weight of his secret plans. On the night of the 13th of June, he gathered guns, tactical gear, and the elaborate notebook of targets. Before leaving, he sent his wife a message asking her to trust him and to flee with the children. For those who knew Vance, the revelation of his double life was devastating. His wife publicly condemned his actions as a betrayal of everything that they held true, and she filed for divorce almost immediately after his arrest. In the end, this friendly neighbor and churchgoer that people thought they knew was the same man who meticulously plotted one of the most chilling attacks in American history. Vance's arrest marked the beginning of a complex legal process that is still unfolding as of the time of this upload. In July of 2025, a federal grand jury indicted him on 6 counts, including 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Melissa and Mark, and multiple firearm and stalking offenses. State prosecutors also added charges of impersonating a police officer and felony animal cruelty for shooting Hortman's dog, Gilbert. The combined allegations make him eligible for the harshest of penalties, life imprisonment, or even the possibility of the death penalty. Vance made his first court appearance in the summer of 2025, shackled and flanked by U.S. Marshals. On the 7th of August, he stood before a federal judge and pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. Given the magnitude of the case, prosecutors successfully argued to designate it as complex, suspending normal speedy trial deadlines. They revealed that the investigation had amassed tens of thousands of pages of evidence and hundreds of media files. The judge agreed that the trial would require extraordinary preparation. No trial date was set, but officials estimated that proceedings might not begin until 2026 or 2027. During the preliminary hearings, Vance showed little emotion, speaking only to confirm his understanding of the charges. His court-appointed defense attorneys have not publicly disclosed any specific strategy, but legal experts expect them to scrutinize every piece of evidence for possible challenges. And as always, the defense could potentially explore Vance's mental state. But for now, Vance remains jailed in federal custody, held without bond. The aftershock of the shootings continued to ripple through Minnesota's communities and the halls of government. In the immediate aftermath, thousands attended vigils to mourn Melissa and Mark Hortman. Their flag-draped coffins and even Gilbert's paw print holding his ashes were displayed so people could pay their respects. Fellow lawmakers from both parties praised Melissa's legacy of public service and promised to honor her memory by improving security for elected officials. John and Yvette Hoffman spent weeks in the hospital, and thankfully they pulled through their grievous injuries. In a statement, the family said, "We are incredibly lucky to be alive," and they thanked the first responders and surgeons who saved their lives. For Vance's family, the events brought public shame and private heartbreak. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the quiet father they knew with the accused murderer on the news. The community will forever remember the 14th of June, 2025 as the morning when political hatred took hold.